Last time, we started the American Civil War, the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. And irony of all ironies, the war is never actually declared. Remember, there's a standoff between forces loyal to the newly declared Confederate States of America and the Union Army on the island of Fort Sumter. Confederate forces bombard the island, Union forces return fire, and based on that skirmish, the federal government declares that the southern states are now in rebellion and calls for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about last time is that this call has serious consequences because really at this point, it's hard to say that we have a civil war. A civil war, in some respects, implies that it's a contest of two factions that are of relatively equal standing, right? Or at least in boxing terms, they're in the same weight class. That's not the case at this point, because remember, we have the entire Union minus about 7 states that seceded, along with or including South Carolina after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. That's not a war, that's a massacre. That's begging for punishment because these are not two equal factions. But what happens is that as Lincoln calls up those 75,000 volunteers, suddenly the states along the border, between North and South. States like, for example, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, Missouri, they start to get a little nervous. And they start realizing that any war between the deep southern states and the rest of the Union would inevitably be fought on their territory. And even though these states were less dependent upon slavery, they were still dependent upon slavery. And so, one by one, after this call up of 75,000 volunteers, these states along the border throw in their lot with the Confederacy. And again, really we see two waves of secession. The one that started in from December to February of 1860 to 61, and then the second wave that happens around April of 1861 after the attack on Fort Sumter. And because of that, the Civil War starts to really begin to take shape. And we should also remember that hindsight is 2020. Obviously, we know which states side with the Union and which states side with the Confederacy. But let's just say that that wasn't always clear cut to people at the time. And so whenever you're asking yourself, what were they thinking when they decided to go to war against the Union, for example, it's important to remember that it was pretty unclear as to how big the Confederate States of America would actually become eventually. So that's the point we'll actually come back to in just a bit. But we do have the beginning of a civil war, and today we're going to talk about basically the shape that the early war took, as well as what people expected and what actually happened, because as is often the case with war, those are two different stories. So the first thing we can say about the Civil War is that, if you look at the map like I just showed you, and you'll see variations of this map, it's easy to believe that the Civil War is about, the Union states versus the Confederate states. That you have this blue blob on the map in the north, that represents the Union. And then in the South, you have a red blob, which represents the Confederate States. And to be honest, that is, one, a gross oversimplification, and also to look at the Civil War in just those terms is in some respects to miss the point of why the war was being fought. And if you ask Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet, they would argue that the southern states never actually left. They're in rebellion. They have never actually left the Union because secession, unilaterally, is unconstitutional. That's point one. But point two is, the fact that saying that the Civil War is just this, red and blue lines on a map is really an oversimplification because the Civil War is really complicated if you actually dig beneath the surface. Yes, the simple explanation and the accurate explanation is that it is a war that is caused by the continuation of chattel slavery. That's easy, but the more difficult, story is what this sometimes leads to, because again, the Civil War is never actually declared. That's complexity one. But it's not just a war that's fought between states. It's sometimes a war that's fought within states. Remember that states are not monolithic entities. And we've talked about the fact that very often the western parts of states, especially along the East Coast, are culturally very different than the eastern parts of states. Especially, by the way, if you're looking at areas of Appalachia. So what actually happens is that in many cases, you have basically states or parts of states that secede from states. So Virginia secedes from the Union after Lincoln makes a call up for 75,000 volunteers. But if you look out into the western foothills of Virginia, in what is now known as West Virginia, emphasis on now known, the people out there living in the mountains, they don't really care about plantations or cash crops. A lot of them are squatters. And, to say nothing of the fact that, the whole idea of, having a big plantation out there in the middle of mountain country, of moonshine country, just seemed laughable and ridiculous. So Western Virginia actually secedes from the seceders. They actually leave the state of Virginia and side with the Union. And also, you have very similar stories in the case of Tennessee, where eastern Tennessee, which is, again, sort of the part of Tennessee that's very mountainous, tends to support the Union. Western Tennessee is the part that's a little bit more agrarian, and they tend to stay loyal to the Confederacy. So you see splits between states where different parts basically follow their own economic interest. But also, it's even more complicated than that. In northern states, you had regiments and bands of Southern sympathizers. And in the South, by the way, every single state but the state of South Carolina had homegrown regiments, in other words, units of approximately around 1,000 troops that fought for the Union. So the Civil War divides the country, it divides states, it also divides families. This is a war that is literally called a war of brother versus brother. And that's not just a catchy title. That's not a slogan. Sometimes that we actually can kind of mean that quite literally. Or a war of father versus son. And there's an instance in the Civil War that comes to my mind. In the documentary series by Ken Burns, The Civil War, they actually go into depth on this anecdote, where there is a naval battle at sea, and a Union naval officer is basically leading a boarding action to capture a Confederate warship. And apparently, when the officer steps over the gangplank onto the Confederate warship, he steps over the body of his own son. Now, that was a particularly unlucky Union officer, it has to be said. And things like that weren't, incredibly common, but at the same time, they weren't incredibly uncommon either. Most people knew at least somebody who was, on the other side of the conflict. And we should also emphasize that the Civil War sometimes divided individuals. And yes, this kind of sounds like, I don't know, I guess this is kind of getting into the realm of frou-frou nonsense, where we talk about, how individuals can actually be in conflict with themselves, but it's actually true. The Civil War is about slavery, and that's the story of how the conflict emerges at the national level. But if you look at why individuals fight, sometimes their motivations could be mixed. So if you look at, for example, somebody whose motivations for fighting have long been discussed, like Robert E. Lee, the eventual commander of the Army of Northern Virginia on the side of the South, Robert E. Lee had really no reason to secede from to support secession from the Union, and at least at first, he opposed the idea of secession. Now, that, by the way, that does not mean that he was necessarily an enemy to slavery. That point has been hotly contested for various reasons about what Lee's personal views were there. But, at the very least, what we can kind of say is that Robert E. Lee had every reason to support the idea of a United States. Lee was somebody who practically married in to American royalty. He was related to George Washington's family by marriage. He had a promising military career ahead of him. He was a war hero during the Mexican-American War, and in fact, Robert E. Lee was offered command of the force of 75,000 volunteers to suppress the Union. Winfield Scott, the war hero of the Mexican-American War, said that if he had to pick any commander to lead the United States Army in a big war, he had only one name, and that was Robert E. Lee. So eventually, Lee is called in and offered command of this army, and Lee turns them down. And he turns them down because, from his perspective, if he leads the federal army to war against the rebellious states, well, then the front lines are right across the Potomac River in his home state of Virginia. And actually, Lee has a house in that basically occupies what is now Arlington National Cemetery, which is, again, right across the Potomac River. In other words, the front lines are in his front yard. Now, that being said, that doesn't necessarily excuse or condone the moral decisions that people took in the war. Moral decisions are immoral decisions. At the end of the day, Lee and other Confederate officers were still fighting for a government that prioritized the defense and existence of chattel slavery. And that ultimately, by the way, ends up being the Confederacy's undoing. And when the Confederacy gets the chance to pick between its survival as a country and the existence of chattel slavery, it chooses chattel slavery every time. So just keep that in mind. But we do have to kind of put that into context at the same time, that the Civil War was a war in which you had people with very divided loyalty. Lee has this quote that's often been paraphrased that goes something like this, that I love the Union, but I love Virginia more. Now, that being said, there were many other Virginians who loved the Union more and fought with the Union. Among them, by the way, was the commander of the United States Army, Winfield Scott himself. So it's a war that's not really just a war of North versus South, because you did have Southerners fight for the Union and Northerners who fought for the Confederacy. It's obviously, as fits, a war as devastating as the Civil War is also a war that has a lot of complexity and nuance. But the Civil War is also unique in American history, not just because of the fact that it's so darn fatal. Because one of the reasons it's fatal is because of the adoption of conscription, at least after the first couple of years of the war has passed. At first, the armies of the North and the South try to get by on through the use of short-term volunteers, because both sides are under this delusion that the war is going to be over quickly. In almost every major war in human history, at least since the last 2,000 years or so, the slogan has always been, the troops will come home by Christmas, or the war will be over by Christmas. It's always Christmas. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas, by the way. But when it's apparent that the war isn't going to be over by Christmas, and in fact might take more than a few Christmases to fully resolve itself, both armies adopt conscription, which is really the use of every able-bodied male of military age in drafting them into the military. So the thing is, as we'll talk about, is that conscription was something that was not applied equitably. There were all kinds of exemptions and loopholes and asterisks that could be applied to the process of conscription, such that generally, if you were very wealthy and well connected, you could very easily get out of military service. But if you were poor, basically you're out of luck. And so you have the slogan, "Rich man's war, poor man's fight." And one of the consequences of conscription means that armies become bigger, and it also means that battles become bloodier because there's more guys with more guns, with more bullets flying. So this is one of the reasons why the Civil War becomes the bloodiest war in United States history. Roughly 30% of Southern white males died during the Civil War. There were roughly 620,000 deaths. And to be honest, as far as I'm aware, that's kind of a lowball estimate. There are some estimates that go as high as a little over 700,000. And by the way, that doesn't include injuries. That doesn't include the million-plus people who were killed, wounded, and injured. And that also doesn't include something that we're more familiar with today, I think, which is the psychological damage that war causes people. The fact that there are some people who are just not able to recover from the trauma they endure during the war. So when you add conscription and when you add the sheer number of casualties, this is something that we associate with what is called total war. Total war is something that we've sort of mentioned with the American Revolution, but a total war is really a war that only makes sense with the emergence of industrialization. So we basically talk about three total wars in this course: the American Civil War, World War I, and World War II. But the idea of total war is that you organize all of society for the purpose of achieving military victory, whatever that looks like. So if you you're not just trying to bring an army to war or battle, you're trying to bring society to war, which means that you're trying to get everybody involved in the war effort. So you want to get the civilian population involved in working in factories for the purpose of, making weapons, or out working on farms for the purpose of growing food to support these vast armies. You want to get people investing in the government so that the government can turn around and buy more weapons, supplies, that kind of thing. In other words, all society gets mobilized for the war effort. And again, this is really something that we associate with the emergence of industrialization, which becomes more and more important as the war goes on. But this really changes the way that wars are fought. So this is kind of Mr. Dry's really simplistic overview of how to win a pre-industrial war. So here it is. You want to win more battles than the other guy. It's also generally a good idea or a good thing if you capture the other side's capital city, or at least a lot of their cities. And just like Call of Duty, I suppose, has taught everybody. It's also really good if you can maintain a high kill-death ratio. Kill more of the enemy than they kill of you. Well, if that is applied to the Civil War, then you know who wins? The Southern states. Especially in the beginning, the Confederacy wins more battles. They certainly, at least in the very beginning, were taking the war more to the Union than the reverse. And throughout the war, the Union tends to lose more troops. Now, there's some reasons for that. The fact that it's a lot harder to attack than it is to defend, but ultimately it doesn't really matter which side loses more battles or which side loses more people, because ultimately what wins a total war is not really battles, not fancy weapons, not clever generals. What wins a war during the Civil War and beyond is your ability to crush the enemy's will to resist. And what happens is that by the end of the American Civil War, the population of the South was ready to throw in the towel. They lost the will to resist. But if that's the goal, if you're not trying to fight just a hostile government, but potentially a hostile population, what does that mean? There are some really terrifying implications that this brings. If you begin to think about war as being a contest not between two rival governments, but between two hostile societies, if you're going to break the enemy's will to resist, well, the solution, as pioneered by the German Air Force during the Blitz, is to bomb the smithereens out of big cities like London and Birmingham and Coventry. That didn't work, but that's kind of the same type of thinking that this leads to. And so one of the things you can kind of tell about total wars is that total wars are ruthless wars, because if your goal is to break the enemy's will to resist, so if they're not producing cannons and they're not supporting the war effort, then what steps is your side going to take to break that will? And that's actually something we'll come back to later on in the Civil War, especially when we get to this event known as Sherman's March to the Sea. One of the other tragic lessons that total war teaches us is the fact that human beings can be remarkably creative if you put a task to us that somehow involves killing another human being. Technology during the American Civil War grows at a very rapid pace, along with industrialization. And this is even considering the fact that we're in a time period that's kind of, renowned for its technological advancements. Everything from the transatlantic telegraph wire to the development of the steamship. But still, if you're just looking at clear evidence of the country changing, you should just look at the military technology at the beginning of the Civil War and at the very end of the Civil War. So if you were to look at the state-of-the-art military technology that existed before the American Civil War, you would point to things like the rifled musket, which is a more accurate version of the musket that George Washington's army went to war with in the 1770s, but it was still recognizably like the same thing. It just shot a little bit better. It basically loaded and fired the same way. If you would put George Washington in a time machine and bring him forward in time to the American Civil War, he would probably know more or less what to do intuitively, because military technology had not really changed demonstrably during that time period. And again, if you look, most warships looked pretty similar to those that were available to George Washington and his forces during the 1770s. Many warships still used three-masted warships that traveled by the power of sail. The steam engine hadn't completely revolutionized all navies yet. So that's at the very beginning of the Civil War. But if you look at the end of the Civil War, you see things like this: a primitive Gatling gun. In other words, we're seeing some of the first automatic, weapons. And you also see ironclad turreted warships that are not, which are recognizably, primitive versions of the type of warships that we have today. I mean, yeah, they don't have computers or anything, but basically the fundamental tech is still there. So that in itself, by the way, says something else, and that is that the Civil War is kind of the midwife to the modern world that we live in. And one of the things that I've heard a historian by the name of H.L. Brands point out is the fact that if you look at American history before the Civil War, it kind of has this quaint look to it. Everything kind of looks like the Shire, almost. But after the Civil War, you see things like skyscrapers. You see the expansion of the railroads. In other words, you start to see the world, or at least the United States, look more recognizable to what it is today. And that's not a coincidence. The Civil War leads to, for better or for worse, the modernization of the country. So when you square all these things together, industrial technology, large armies raised by conscription, and a civilian population that just doesn't want to throw in the towel and is going to fight to the end, which is kind of what the Total War is about, what does the end result look like? Well, it looks a little bit like this. This is Richmond before the breakout of the Civil War, in 1860, actually. This is Richmond around the time of the end of the Civil War. Very often, when you ask people, if I were to just take this photograph and present it without context and ask people, where do you think this comes from? I've heard people make guesses that range from anywhere from, Dresden, Germany, after the city was firebombed. Invariably you have answers that come from the Second World War. And I think that that's kind of instructive, that, the Civil War, like the Second World War, are total wars. And that's ultimately what total wars look like. That sometimes entire cities are more or less destroyed during the Civil War. And that in itself makes it unprecedented. During the crisis in Kansas, we talked about the fact that some cities and towns were ransacked, right? But you don't see the destruction of wholesale metropolises like you do in the Civil War, where cities like Richmond and Atlanta are practically razed. In other words, kind of destroyed. And that's also a consequence of the American Civil War. Pictures like this may spoil the answer to the next question I'm going to ask, which is, who actually wins the Civil War? Yes, obviously the Union does. Hopefully you guys all knew that before you actually enrolled in this class. But it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because the question is really, who benefits the most from the Union victory in 1865? Your first answer might be, what about the 3.5 million black slaves that had been freed due to the 13th Amendment? Well, you can make that argument. You can also make the argument that for those former black slaves, now sharecroppers, that life really hasn't changed all that dramatically. Again, that in other words, that's a less clear-cut case than we might like it to be. So if, arguably, if the Civil War isn't an overwhelming victory for the 3.5 million black slaves who have waited patiently for their freedom, who actually does benefit from the American Civil War? And for better or for worse, if there is a clear winner, it's probably this guy. Which it's kind of unfair because he's dead. But the fact is that Alexander Hamilton, I would argue, is the clear winner of the American Civil War. Because, and we're not just talking about, a redo of the deal with Aaron Burr. What I mean is that Hamilton's vision of the United States is vindicated by the Civil War. We've talked about those two dueling visions, the Jeffersonian vision of the country and the Hamiltonian vision, and how they're kind of at loggerheads throughout American history. Well, no longer. Because what happens is, for one, the states that have always supported Jefferson's vision of the country, well, they leave the Union. They secede from the Union, and so they've actually they no longer have a voice in Congress to oppose things like national banks or tariffs or supportive infrastructure. Instead, the states that like those things, they're the ones who stay with the Union, and so. It's one of the reasons why in the Civil War you see a lot of change happen very, very quickly, because suddenly secession, yeah, it's a national problem, but there's also a silver lining there for states that, for example, want a federal government that supports industry or trade or manufacturing. Suddenly, they find that they're able to get stuff done very quickly. The passage of, for example, a transcontinental railroad, which precipitated a sectional crisis in Kansas and Nebraska, if you remember. Well, in the Civil War, that's kind of done and over with without any drama or fanfare. And in fact, there's a whole lot of other stuff like that. There's the fact that you have a bill in which the federal government offers to sell land on the cheap to small farmers for $5 for 40-acre plots, and which, by the way, was ridiculously cheap. And to be honest, so long as those farmers agreed to settle that land and farm it for, I think it's like 5 or 10 years, at the end of those 5 or 10 years, they would be able to keep the land for free. And remember that there was that debate as to how that land was going to be used. Is that land going to be used for chattel slavery and big plantations? Is that going to be used to help small farmers? Well, during the Civil War, we get the answer to that. And it also helps that if you were to ask people like Lincoln or Winfield Scott or Ulysses S. Grant, the people who take on, let's say, important positions during the Civil War, they would argue that things like industry, trade, manufacturing, and finance are super effective in not just maintaining a strong economy, but maintaining a strong war effort. And the fact that the Union more or less just outproduces the Confederacy. And the fact that that is, ultimately what brings the Confederacy to its knees, that certainly helps Hamilton's case even more. If there are winners, there have to be losers. So not only are we tasked with figuring out why the Union wins the Civil War, the other question that we have to ask is, why does the Confederacy lose the Civil War? I know that there's that whole thing that there are no dumb questions, and I generally believe it. I don't think this is a dumb question. I do think it's the wrong question. Because I think the better question is, if you look at the starting strengths of each side, the better question is, why does the Confederacy not overwhelmingly lose the war on day one? Because if you're looking for the things that actually matter in war, especially a total war, things like a large population of military age, weapons manufacturing output, that kind of thing, like every conceivable advantage was on the side of the Union. So, like, for example, even if you're looking at population, the Union had 23 million people. The South, the Confederacy, had about 9 million people. So, okay, the Union only outnumbers the Confederacy by like 2.5 to 1. But it's actually worse than that, because in that 9 million figure, you also have to include 3.5 million slaves. And those 3.5 million slaves, as you might expect, were not too enthusiastic about fighting for their continued bondage and servitude. So the only, even by the way, if you think about traditional advantages that we normally associate with the South, the fact that the South is more agrarian, the fact is there was actually more farmland in the North, and the fact that the North had a supermajority of farm acreage, that figure actually underplays the Norse agrarian superiority. Because the thing is that, remember, when we say the South was agrarian, we're not saying they're growing turnips or something. We mean that their economy, the economy of the southern states, was focused on cash crop agriculture. Well, cash crops are fantastic so long as you can sell them. If you can't sell them, like maybe in wartime when an enemy is blockading your ports, well, what can you really do with it? I mean, you can't really eat cotton, or at least I wouldn't suggest that you do that. So, in other words, a lot of the traditional advantages that we might even associate with the South, you know, the South is just overwhelmed day one. But as we'll talk a little bit more about, the South doesn't win on day one. They actually fight for quite a long time. And that in itself is historically significant. And we'll come back to that point in a little bit. So the other thing that we have to talk about, or we should go ahead and talk about, is that, as the figures suggest, slavery was the thing that the southern states were fighting for, but it was also a liability. The two things that we associate with the Confederate States of America, slavery and states' rights, were both things and principles that caused the southern states to lose. So if you have states that justify seceding from the Union to protect slavery as being constitutional because of states' rights, well, that begins to have consequences. The southern states really need to come together and basically support a strong centralized government that can fight a war. That was at least what Jefferson Davis saw his job of being, to basically help lead the South through the Civil War with strong leadership. But what happens throughout the war is that many of the southern states are eventually sort of start actually believing some of the language of states' rights. And so when the Confederate government orders state governments to do X or Y, these state governments don't feel a need to listen. State governments still issued their own currency to the very end of the war, and many of them, resorted to hyperinflation in order to do that. We'll also talk a little bit about the consequences of that. But like we said, slavery itself was also a liability. Slaves couldn't be drafted in the Confederate Army. We'll talk about some proposals to see that happen that never really came to fruition. But ultimately, even to the most brainwashed fire eater, that seemed a little sketch. The idea of relying upon slaves for the defense of the Confederacy. And also, the fact is that Southerners were genuinely spooked at the prospect of a generalized slave rebellion. So it also meant that resources had to be allocated to ensure that slaves remained compliant, even during the war itself. If you compare that to the Union, at the very beginning of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln doesn't really suffer from those same disadvantages. Unlike Jefferson Davis, who wants to centralize but can't, Lincoln ferociously centralizes the powers of the federal government. And by the way, this leads to, let's say, one of the more controversial episodes in Lincoln's presidency. To really explain that episode, we have to go back to the tidal wave of Confederacy, or at least secession, that swept the country in early 1861. So remember that secession began in the deep southern states. Then, after Fort Sumter, you saw Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia break away. But there were some states on the border between North and South that had ties to both regions. Now, one of those states was, of course, Maryland. Maryland, like Virginia, was settled to basically be a plantation colony. Like Virginia, it specialized in growing cash crops. And Maryland specifically is in a very unique geographical position, because if you remember your compromise of 1791, it was agreed that the new national capital should be placed in the middle of two southern states, Virginia and Maryland. Maryland is still a slave state, and there were many Marylanders who wanted to secede from the Union and join the other southern states. Well, not only would that be bad because Maryland is, like Virginia, a very industrial southern state, a very wealthy southern state, it also, along with Virginia, completely surrounds the federal capital. And so if both Maryland and Virginia secede from the Union, then the Union might lose the war before it actually gets started. So if you're Abraham Lincoln, you cannot, under any circumstances, allow Maryland to secede from the Union. And in order to enforce that, he is forced, at least in his own mind, to suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a word that means a lot of different things, but it actually means it's involved with several pre-constitutional rights. The right to actually be arrested for a good reason and to be informed of the reason that you've been arrested. The right to a speedy trial. The right not to just be held in prison forever. In other words, these are very important rights, especially if you're ever in a situation in which you recognize that you don't have these rights. You see, they're easy to take for granted until you don't have them. But Abraham Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War to imprison several dozen politicians in Maryland, mayors, councilmen, aldermen, and hold them without trial. Now, is that constitutional? Well, no. At least it's difficult to argue that it is, because for the most part, these were political figures who were guilty of expressing opinions that might appear to be treasonous. But treason isn't just thought crime. It usually requires some kind of substantial step, in addition to simply having treasonous intent. At the very least, Abraham Lincoln gets quite a bit of pushback, and eventually the Supreme Court, led by Roger Taney of Dred Scott fame, says that this suspension of habeas corpus is unconstitutional. But because the Supreme Court had squandered a lot of its legitimacy in the Dred Scott decision, Lincoln basically channels his inner Andrew Jackson and just ignores the Supreme Court, and actually, for a time, considers putting Taney in jail too. Now, it's easy to kind of be hard on Lincoln here, especially since if you ask Lincoln why he was fighting the southern states, at this point, he would argue that he wasn't fighting to end slavery. That comes later. At this point, he's arguing that he is trying to protect the Constitution. In his mind, secession is unconstitutional. He subscribes to the theory that the Union is a compact of the people of the United States, and for the states to unilaterally withdraw from the Union is unconstitutional and treasonable. So you've got that. But at the same time, in order to protect the Constitution, Lincoln either violates it or at least, let's say, dances on the line. And that's, again, putting it generously. But, again, it's easy to be difficult on Lincoln. But we have to remember that the alternative would be to, I suppose, let Maryland secede from the Union. And if you let Maryland secede from the Union, you basically ensure that if the Union doesn't lose the war, then at the very least it's well on its way to losing the war. So sometimes, I guess, if there is a case to be made that in some cases wars involve choices that are not always good choices, maybe this is one of those situations. During the Civil War, power concentrates itself into the federal government and specifically within the executive branch to an unprecedented degree. And one of the other things we see in all total wars is this tacit bargain that we'll come back to between the executive branch and Congress, because the executive branch tends to become more powerful during wartime because war is something that is usually directed by the executive branch itself. Being commander in chief of the armed forces is one of the main responsibilities of the president of the United States. So generally, and this is not really a law that's passed or anything, but there's this general understanding between Congress and the executive branch that the executive branch will get some leeway, some discretion to prosecute the war as they see fit. But after the war is over, all the power that's been delegated to the executive branch will eventually be relinquished back to the legislative branch. And by the way, those transitions are always very messy. It certainly was in the Civil War, and it's also very messy during both of the World Wars. So one of the things that you hopefully get from this is that when we're talking about the American Civil War, in a lot of respects, we're talking about more than just the Civil War. We're talking about the same pattern that we see in all of the big wars in American history. But the other thing that was a liability for the South was, of course, slavery. The South leads the Union to defend slavery, but it ultimately proves to be, a liability for it. For the Union, slavery actually becomes an asset because of the fact that in the United States Army, you have entire regiments of African American troops that are formed, and roughly 80% of those African American troops are escaped slaves from the South. One of the more interesting opinions that you can, or let's say one of the ways to kind of reframe the American Civil War is that in some respects, the Southern planters were right. They should have been afraid of a massive slave uprising because that's exactly what ends slavery, except that it's not a slave uprising of the Toussaint, the Overture variety, in which slaves rise up and actually do come after white people everywhere. Instead, what happens is that you see a very different kind of slave rebellion. You see nearly 200,000 African Americans join the Union Army in an effort to free their fellow slaves, which is just kind of an outstanding thing to think about. The fact that nearly 200,000 African Americans would join the side of a government that had conspired to keep them in bondage for so long. It's one of those sort of warm fuzzy moments in American history, and there aren't very many warm fuzzy moments during the Civil War, I think, but this is one of them. The Civil War, as I've said many times, is the deadliest war in American history. Partially that's because of the scale and the stakes involved, but it's also partially because a lot of the early leaders were morons. If this is maybe a little cruel, but if you've ever had to teach somebody older than you how to use technology, like me, for instance, it's probably going to be an exercise in futility and frustration. Well, what's happened is that a lot of the generals at the very beginning of the American Civil War had basically come of age during the War of 1812 or the Mexican-American War. In other words, they've come of age when you have very different military technology. And yes, I know I did say that the technology between the American Civil War and the American Revolution was recognizably the same. There was one very key difference, and that is starting around the 1840s and 1850s, we see the mass production of rifled muskets. Basically, rifling involves some grooves in a musket barrel that allows bullets to basically spin, and for various reasons that we won't get into, allows the bullet to be much more accurate. And because the bullets are much more accurate, they're also much faster, they go farther, and they're much more lethal. So if you were to look at the muskets that most Americans went to war with against Mexico, the 1842 patterned Springfield musket, it had an effective range of about 140 yards. So, roughly a football field and a half. That doesn't mean that you could reliably hit a target at those ranges. Generally, most trained marksmen, needed a target to be within 50 yards or so in order to realistically have a chance of hitting it. And even still, the odds are basically 50-50 that that person will actually hit the target. So that's the way, or that's the accuracy of muskets during, the time period right before the American Civil War. But then, around the 1850s, you see some radical advances in the range of rifles during this time period. And so, instead of muskets being accurate at ranges of 75 yards, you see muskets that are accurate at around 400 yards. Not actually all that different from the effective ranges of modern day military rifles today, at least the assault rifles, that kind of thing. So in other words, we see the killing power and killing range of weapons increase while we're still using a lot of the same tactics in the American Revolution, where it's still hip and military chic to stick the spiky thing on the end of your musket and charge into battle and break the enemy line in some glorious melee charge. If you want to know why the American Civil War was so bloody, that's maybe a lot of it. And the bullets again are much more accurate, and again, they're much more lethal. The Binet bullets that were fired during this time period, they tended to split up when entering the human body, which meant that the odds of getting, of dying because of infection increased quite a bit as well. Probably the most noteworthy example of this is that during the end of the American Civil War, I believe, Union General John Sedgwick, happens upon a unit of troops that are taking fire from Confederate sharpshooters. And apparently Sedgwick decides that it's appropriate to humiliate these soldiers for, feeling a sense of self-preservation and ducking, and says they couldn't hit an elephant from this distance. And for some reason, that's the last thing that he said, because, he was kind of shot immediately after that. And you have those moments in the Civil War which, illustrate just how, what a dramatic increase there's been in the killing power of technology during this conflict. So one of the consequences of this is that we see scenes like this in Civil War battles. And by the way, take a look at really what we're looking at. We're not looking at a portrait here. We're not looking at, scenes like this of, soldiers sort of decked out in martial splendor with fancy dress, epaulets and all that. we're not seeing that. We're seeing war as this actually, as as it actually happens. Because starting around the mid 19th century, you see the development of photography. First, it's something called the daguerreotype, and then later on, the technology becomes more and more sophisticated. So before, I mean, it's not as if the American Civil War is the first really bad war in history, or even in American history. The American Revolution and the French and Indian War were also nothing to sneeze at either. But at the very least, you didn't have scenes like this that came home from the front. You didn't have portraits of dead bodies everywhere. And even if you did, even if you go back and remember that portrait of the death of Wolfe, the death of this British general who has just won the Battle of Quebec, at the very least, it's portrayed as some kind of glorious sacrifice. It's not a portrayal of death as it actually looks, which is not all that glamorous. In fact, it looks kind of terrifying. And these pictures are, being republished in newspapers, in books, in periodicals, and that in itself shapes the way in which the war is covered, and it also shapes the way in which the war is experienced. But believe it or not, probably the most decisive technological development in the Civil War, at least from a military level, is not a fancy new bomb or gun. We talk about the fact that the Civil War uses, the first real submarine that's used successfully. We talk about the fact that you see the use of the hot air balloon in the Civil War, but really all that pales in comparison to the train. The decisiveness of the railroad was signified in the very first big battle of the American Civil War itself, the first battle of Bull Run / the first battle of Manassas. So one kind of weird fact about the Civil War is that the federal capital was located, as we've already said, in Washington City. Duh. But what's not appreciated as much is the fact that the Confederate capital was located in Richmond, Virginia, less than 100 miles away. So, in other words, the two national capitals of the Union and Confederacy, respectively, were really just within a couple of, really less than a few days ride from one another. So one of the consequences of this is that a lot of what we sort of think of as the American Civil War really takes place along a narrow stretch of land from Richmond to Washington, D.C. And of course, the tourism industry in Virginia has made a killing on this, not just in the war, but after it. But that being said, this means that whoever could take the other's capital first is going to obtain a decisive advantage. And so both the Union and the Confederacy, sort of focus a lot of their strategy on taking the other's capital city. Well, the Union has kind of a built-in advantage here because the Confederacy is still trying to establish an organized military, whereas even though the Union military is still small, it's at least organized and it already has officers and generals. They're not having to start from scratch. So realizing that the Union has a slight advantage here, and also knowing that it's a good idea to nip the Confederacy in the bud before it spreads, Abraham Lincoln orders the commander of the army located in Washington, D.C., General Irvin McDowell, to make a beeline for the city of Richmond. At first, McDowell is a little hesitant. But as Lincoln because basically, by the way, McDowell says that his army is untrained and inexperienced. But as Lincoln points out very shrewdly, the Confederate Army is also untrained and inexperienced. So at the very least, there's an even chance. So the army located in Washington, D.C., crosses the Potomac River and makes its way towards Richmond. and the Confederacy nearly has a panic attack. They're unprepared for this sudden Union onslaught. In fact, it looks like the Confederate Army, such that it was, is going to be pushed all the way back to Richmond. But then a couple of things happen. As the Union Army advances, it gets close to a railway junction called Manassas Junction. It's at that point that reinforcements are rushed up from other parts of Virginia, and the Confederate Army, commanded by Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter, is reinforced. And at that point, McDowell's army comes smack dab into reinforcements led by General Stonewall Jackson's corps, which manages to repulse the Union Army. Now, this means that the first big battle of the Civil War is a Confederate victory. But it doesn't end the war. In fact, that is why the Battle of Bull Run is decisive. The fact that, wait for it, it wasn't decisive. How does that work, you may ask? Well, remember that both sides sort of operate under the delusion that the war is going to be over quickly. And partially this, I mean, a few people have, kind of a rational argument for why they think the war is going to be over quickly. But very often throughout history, whether it's the British rushing to enlist in 1914, the Americans rushing to sign up in 1941, or, just in the history of warfare in general, most belligerent countries have populations that think that their cause is right, just, that God is on their side. And so, of course, because we're right, we're just, we're awesome, we're, of course, going to beat the other side. And then what happens throughout history is that eventually people figure out that, war is kind of tough. You might get hurt, maybe even killed. And so what happens in most big wars, like the American Civil War, is there's that point where both sides realize that, in fact, this is not going to be a short war. This is actually going to be a much longer war. And so what the Battle of Bull Run demonstrates is that this is not going to be an easy war or a short war. And it's also important to remember that at the Battle of Bull Run, there were more casualties in that battle than in all wars in American history up to that point combined. And by the way, compared to some of the other later battles in the American Civil War, like the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Battle of Shiloh, believe it or not, the Battle of Bull Run is not, that big of a battle compared to some of the other battles we're going to see. That just gives you an idea of how big the Civil War actually was. But again, the reason why the Confederacy was saved from defeat is because that area of Virginia was one of the few areas in the South connected by railway. And so it's maybe not a coincidence that one of the things that Congress does in 1862 is they really prioritize the construction of railroads. The railroad becomes a weapon to a certain extent in the Civil War. And for hundreds of thousands of soldiers, particularly in the North, their experience in the Civil War wasn't fighting Robert E. Lee's army in Northern Virginia. Their experience was instead walking, the endless plains, protecting sections of the railroads, because railroads ensured that you could move troops and supplies faster than your enemy. And of course, the Union has a definite advantage here. But the Pacific Railroad Act is passed by Congress in 1862. And while you won't see the benefits immediately, the benefits do come. So 7 years later, you have this photograph taken at Promontory Summit, Utah, the location where the eastern and western stretches of the Transcontinental Railroad, breathed into life by the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, um, comes into being. At this point, both coasts of the United States are connected by railway. And by the end of the 19th century, travel from one coast to the other can be undertaken in less than a week's time. And so the economic consequences of this are, and by the way, forget economics, like the cultural consequences of this can't even begin to be calculated because for the first time in American history, the American people are connected from one coast to another by a continuous line of railway in which goods and people and services can be moved, within just a week's time. It also is the story of something else because obviously the Transcontinental Railroad is something that allows people, especially enterprising businessmen, to make a fortune. And what's really interesting is that many of the robber barons that we'll talk about probably after Christmas during the Gilded Age, a lot of them get their start during the American Civil War. Some of you have probably heard of Andrew Carnegie, who is the person who is responsible for starting the Steel Trust in the United States. At this point in Carnegie's career, he is supervising, at least at this point during the Civil War, the mobilization and the transfer of Union troops at the Battle of Manassas. By the way, like many of the robber barons, whether you're talking about J.P. Morgan or Carnegie, Carnegie basically purchases an exemption from military service. Now, in Carnegie's case, it's because he had special skills, at least that's what he thought, and he wanted to participate in the war effort by sort of working in the sort of the railroad industry. Now, of course, for his part, Carnegie was a very valuable member or a valuable part of the war effort in that respect. But it's kind of interesting that a lot of the robber barons again sort of get their start or sort of climb up the ladder because of the American Civil War. The fact that the federal government encourages industries to grow larger than they ever have before is another explanation for why, after the American Civil War, big business is really big business. That big business is so powerful that they can even compete against the federal government for political influence. And that's another sort of unintended consequence of the Civil War that we should go ahead and be familiar with. Anyway, the Battle of Bull Run, again, demonstrated that this was not going to be a short war. And it, from the Battle of Bull Run onward, we can see the emergence of conscription. Now, the way conscription works in both the North and the South is a little different. So in the South, conscription was treated a little bit more seriously. And the reason is math. Remember that there aren't as many white Southerners of military age as there are Northerners of military age. Because remember, Northerners can basically conscript from the white population as well as the black population. So from the perspective of the Confederate States, they need every person they can get. So conscription laws were generally treated very seriously in the South. But Southern states generally offered exemptions and exceptions for military service. In the South, you could, in lieu of military service, you could pay roughly $300 for an exemption. You could also, or I'm sorry, $500 for an exemption. And you could also, interestingly, get an exemption if you owned 20 or more slaves. So I hear you guys scratching your heads, and I'm hoping the reason is more than just dandruff. I'm hoping that the reason is, as you may point out, 3 a.m. Isn't it a little weird that the people who have the most at stake in the Civil War are exempted from military service? The people in whose interest the Civil War is being fought don't actually have to serve on the front lines. Is that what you're telling me? You crazy old man? Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And yes, I am a crazy old man. And sometimes history is crazy like that. The argument for why the elite planters were exempted from the Civil War, or at least military service, is the argument that the South doesn't have factories, it doesn't have industry. The only thing that it has cash crops that it can sell in exchange for weapons and supplies, that kind of thing. And so to ensure the continued flow of goods, you have to preserve the planter class. But obviously, it doesn't take a cynical person to, let's say, be skeptical of that argument. And so one of the things that becomes a battle cry, both in the North, but especially in the South, is that the Civil War is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. In the sense that because the war really is fought for slavery, and because the slave owners aren't actually subject to military service, that ordinary Southerners don't have skin in the game. And for the most part, that's true. Most Southerners who are conscripted don't own slaves. And of course, most whites in the South don't own slaves, and those that do generally own maybe one or two, not 20 or more, which is generally kind of the definition of what it means to be a planter. That being said, many Southerners still fought because, again, there's that whole argument that Southerners don't want to be last, or that maybe one day they could hope to earn enough money to purchase slaves. But at the very least, the impact of the war was disproportionately felt by the very people who couldn't even dream of affording a slave. Now, obviously, the situation is somewhat different in the North. In the North, you could basically earn an exemption if you paid $300 in cash. And you could also theoretically defer military service if you provide an exemption. This is where you basically adopt a soldier who volunteers to serve in your stead. And you pay for the soldier's equipment and see to the soldier's well-being. And many people actually did this, as callous as it seems. And in fact, this was a practice that was common in both the North and the South. The impact that conscription has on both American history and culture is, you really can't calculate it. So for one, especially if you're talking about the history of the American Civil War, remember that Abraham Lincoln was characterized in the South and also in some parts of the North as being a tyrant, because he dared to dream that it might be necessary to raise an army of over 75,000 men to fight a war to suppress insurrection in the South. People thought he was crazy or tyrannical, or maybe both, for simply suggesting that. And as events at Bull Run demonstrated, if anything, Abraham Lincoln lowballed the estimate. So by the end of the American Civil War, out of a country that, or out of a side, I suppose you're looking at the Union, at the northern states, out of a population of roughly 23 million people, the Union Army numbered over 1 million men. It was, at the time, the largest army on planet Earth in 1865. And this is incredibly extraordinary when you consider the fact that the United States ends the war as a military superpower. It's one of the first time in American history that we can actually use that term. It quickly demobilizes, though, but of course there are some major cultural consequences. The fact that, now millions of Americans, of an entire generation, have some common experience of military service. It changes voting behavior. It changes, economic behavior. It causes, so many changes in our cultural consciousness and how we see ourselves. But probably, at least in the near term, the big question is, after you've conscripted all of these soldiers, what are you going to do with them? And that depends on whether you are a Union officer or a Confederate officer. If you are Winfield Scott, who is the first commander of the Union Army at the very beginning of the Civil War. And it has to be said, Winfield Scott has been a field commander since the War of 1812. He's smart. He is actually a very, very clever general. The problem is just he's too old to kind of go and campaign with the army itself. But he does kind of establish the overall strategy that the Union more or less adheres to throughout the American Civil War. What Scott realized is that this is a war in which the South is essentially trying to protect the economic interest of a small group of people, the planters. And Scott realized that if you hurt those people, if you make them feel the burn, then maybe you will crush their will to resist. And so basically the choke point, the bottleneck here is cotton, and whether or not you can sell that cotton. And all you really need to do if you're the Union is just use your superior naval superiority and prevent the South from trading with foreign powers. And if you do that, you eventually choke the life out of the Confederacy, which is, the source for its name. It's the most rock and roll name ever, the Anaconda Plan, because an anaconda, the anaconda's no sissy. The anaconda doesn't need to, unfairly kill its prey with venom or anything like that. No, when an anaconda sees what it wants, it just goes right up to it and it gives it a big hug. And maybe strangles it to death and then eats its prey whole. That's how an anaconda fights a war. That's how Winfield Scott wanted to fight the American Civil War. And for the most part, that is how the Civil War is won, except that this plan, let's just say that it only gets us maybe 70% of the way there, because it doesn't, if anything, Scott, like most of the military commanders, if anything, underestimates the degree of suffering and punishment in which the South can take. And by the way, that's a common mistake that you see in the history of warfare. The Germans made the same mistake with the British. The Americans made the same mistake with the Japanese. For some reason, we always assume that the country or the people we're fighting against will throw in the towel sooner than we will. But as it happens, that doesn't quite make the enemy feel the burn. And so eventually what happens is that William Tecumseh Sherman will bring the burn to the enemy. Literally a scorched earth campaign that's basically launched in the Deep South. But that's basically the core of the Union's war effort. And the other thing you have to remember is that the other part is that the Union has to control the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is this kind of natural highway that connects vast areas of the South. And the idea is that if you control the Mississippi River by occupying most of the strategic cities and ports along that river, then you basically cut the South in two. You basically cut it into eastern and western halves. So you control and blockade major ports along the coast, and you also take control of the Mississippi River. That's the Union's architect or plan for victory. For the South, it's a little bit different. One of the interesting things about the South, and just the Confederacy in general, is that many Southerners sort of see parallels between the American War for Independence and the Confederacy's attempt to secede from the Union. They argue that the American War of Independence was about a series of small independent colonies seeking independence from an overbearing, tyrannical central government. Well, from the perspective of Jefferson Davis and company, just substitute the the British with the federal government, and you basically get the American Civil War. But sometimes what happens is that life imitates art, but also art imitates life. And so if we have this sort of very artistic depiction of the American Civil War as being a second war for independence, sometimes people almost unconsciously in the South saw the war through that lens. And so people and strategists like Davis and Robert E. Lee might think of the American Revolution and how the founders won that war. And what they come back to is the fact that ultimately the American War of Independence was won because of European recognition and support. The argument is that, you know, in the American Revolution, the founders were able to entice the Europeans with things like freedom and, new concepts of liberty and the Enlightenment. Well, that doesn't really matter as much because this go around we have cotton, which is more important anyway. And the British and the French ultimately are going to be more loyal to their purse strings than their political ideals and principles. So the idea is that if you apply enough pressure to the European powers, if you leverage King Cotton, then ultimately the European powers will provide the Confederacy some degree of recognition, and they might get involved. And then at that point, the fact that the Union government doesn't recognize the independence of the Confederacy becomes academic. So, and at various points, Napoleon III, the Emperor of the French, actually writes to Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, and asks about whether or not it would be, proper to recognize an independent Confederate States of America. The problem that the Confederates have is the same problem that the Americans in the War of Independence have, in that the Confederates feel like they need to go out of their way to demonstrate that they can actually be independent in fact as well as in name. They need to win battles and demonstrate that they can actually survive. And this leads them down a pathway which eventually culminates into the very rough battles at Gettysburg, it has to be said. But one of the sort of unintended consequences of this is that it leads to the Union government coming into conflict in some parts, at some points at least, with other European powers. In the early part of the war, there is a mail ship that is commanded by the British that is basically impounded, stopped and searched by an American warship, which kind of smacked a lot of impressment, except in reverse, because it's the Americans that are kind of doing the stopping and seizing, that kind of thing. But the reason that the Americans actually stopped the trend is because the ship was carrying a Confederate diplomat. So at this point, by the way, the British are outraged that one of their ships has actually been searched, and there is during a very short period of time, in the very beginning of the American Civil War, there's this fear that the war might escalate and include Great Britain. Actually, Lincoln's Secretary of War, a rather testy person by the name of Edwin M. Stanton actually advises Lincoln to go ahead and declare war on Britain too, as if maybe that was like a source of American unity. You know, we can always find some sort of common bond by declaring war against Great Britain. At this point, you have to imagine that Lincoln just kind of face palms and says to Stanton, quote, "one war at a time," and he lets the Confederate diplomat go. Again, seizing a diplomat in normal circumstances like this would have been seen as, a breach of international law to the extent that international law existed. But the argument the federal government used to justify this is that this individual isn't a diplomat. They are an agent of a traitorous government. Basically, this person is a rebel. So those little distinctions like that have some major consequences, and it almost leads the United States into conflict with European powers. This has been the story of how a political rebellion can become a total war. Next time, we'll talk about how a total war can become a crusade on the road towards the Emancipation Proclamation. That's for next time.